this afternoon in the way that all of the best stories do, on a dark and stormy night. On this dark and stormy night in the middle of the 1700s, a slave ship captain waited on his boat. The storm had torn a hole in the side of the ship and water was flooding it. He cried out to God and he said, "If you let me survive this, I will dedicate myself to a better life. I will dedicate myself to ending the institution of slavery." He kept that promise, and he wrote a song about it. You know this song. You know the song, Amazing Grace. You've sung it 100 times. That song captures the story of his dedication. Slavery began to unravel on May 22nd, 1787, when Newton met with 11 other men in a print shop in London, and they devised a campaign that would be slavery's undoing. Those men included a parliamentarian named Wilberforce. It included Josiah Wedgwood, who was an industrialist and the Steve Jobs of his day. It included Olaudah Equiano, a former slave who was willing to bring his story to the change that they so desired. They used every tool available to them at the time and created the hallmark for any contemporary social justice campaign. They created a newsletter to connect their activists. They created political cartoons to mock slave owners and the institution of slavery. One of the things that they recognized that they could do was launch a boycott of sugar. Why sugar? Because sugar was a product that was produced primarily by slaves. Also, because the purchases of sugar were made by women. Women couldn't vote, but they were activists, and they recognized that they could enlist them in that campaign. And so, sugar use dropped by 1/3. It took them 20 years. But through their sophisticated use of communication, they end the slave trade in England in a way that has reverberations throughout the world. So if you think about the staggering changes that have happened in this country in the past 50 years, you could think about how Jim Crow laws that kept millions from voting have collapsed. You could think about the fact that deaths associated with drunken driving have dropped by 50% since the 1980s. In the 1940s, almost half of all Americans smoked, and today fewer than 20% do. Here in Florida, where we lead the way, only 7% of teenagers are smoking. So you could look at these changes and you could see them as a society awakening to injustice. You could see them as the organic result of changing moods and changing tastes, or you could see them as a visceral reaction to what should not be. But if you looked at them solely in that light, you would miss something really big and really important, which is that in each and every one of these cases, there was a small but sophisticated group of people who recognized that change required not only awareness, but strategy. These things did not happen by chance, they were designed. So the purpose of my role here, the reason I'm here at the University of Florida, is because of a charismatic trailblazer named Frank Karel. And Frank Karel recognized that change would be nearly impossible without a dedicated focus on communication. Understanding who needs to stop doing something they're doing or start doing something new, who the target audience is to create lasting change. And so he created a chair here at the University of Florida, and it is my job to build and nurture this form of communications. We call it public interest communications, and it is the evolution from this kind of sophisticated activism into an academic discipline. So, how are we going to do that? before I tell you, I want to share a story about a book. And I think that this book gives us such a terrific example of the way that a more targeted approach to communications can make a lasting change. So this book is Ulysses. I know you've all read it. Ulysses was published in 1922 to great literary acclaim. A publisher in the United States, the owner of Random House, acquired the rights to publish the book in 1933, and he really wants to publish it because he knows he's going to make millions from publishing this book, but he's got a problem. The book's been banned in the United States because people think that it's obscene. And so if he publishes the book, he's got a problem because the book's going to be seized. So he needs to strike down the censorship of the book. So he devises a plan. And he connects with an attorney named Morris Ernst. And Morris Ernst is an expert in censorship. And together, they come up with an idea for a campaign. And their campaign is that they are going to raise awareness of this issue and get celebrities involved and get them to talk about how dangerous censorship is to contemporary society. No, they didn't actually do that. And they did not do a viral online campaign. They did none of these. No. They created a campaign with a target audience of one person. Their vision was if they could find the right judge, if they could find a judge who understood the literary significance of this novel, they could get the ban struck down. And so they did their research and they found the judge and a man named James Woolsey. And then they hired somebody to take a ship into the port of New York, which was under the jurisdiction of Woolsey, and they get the book smuggled in. So this poor guy who's been hired to do this has the book in his suitcase. He's waiting there at customs for the customs officer to seize the book so it can be introduced into evidence. Oh, but he has a problem. It's hot, and the customs officer is tired, and he doesn't want it. He's like, hey, go on, it's cold. And he's like, oh, no. I have got some stuff in here that you really should take a look at. And it's not until he insists, and the custom officer recognizes that nobody is going anywhere that day, that he seizes the book. It's introduced into evidence. The ban is struck down by the judge. The book is on press within the first 10 minutes of the decision. And a lasting blow is delivered against censorship in America. So this is a field that we need to build. We need to create a world where this kind of focused and strategic thinking is part of how we think about driving social change. So I want to take a minute and share with you a definition of public interest communications that probably has a better place in a textbook than it does here at TED. But I want to share it with you because I want to highlight a particular point, and it's a word that we've heard several times today. And that word is transcends. Public interest communication transcends the interest of any individual or any organization. It is about taking something on in a strategic and thoughtful way that will make a lasting difference in society and benefit us all. So how do we get there? Well, to build this field, we're doing three things. One, we're establishing curriculum. There are students in this room who are the first in their generation to be able to study public interest communication, to choose it as a career path. Two, we need science and scholarship. And three, we need to build community among the people who are already working in this field but who have never known what to call it. One of the ways that we're doing that is through the Frank Gathering here in Gainesville, where we're attracting movement builders from throughout the world to come and share the best of what they know, like beloved books. This year we heard from people like Anastasia Koo, who, working through Human Rights Campaign, turned the entire internet red in support of marriage equality. We heard from Bobby Jones, who's recognizing that as social values move toward the greater good, that there's an opportunity to force and compel the corporate world to bring their voices to social change. And we heard from Taylor Brandon, who's a senior at DePaul University, who worked at the Food Recovery Network and who is among this generation of young people to say, this is my future, this is how I want to spend my life. And along the way, we connected scholars and journalists and activists, and they had fun and they played together. We're also building a site, Frank Digital, where we are connecting fantastic stories from throughout the web. We're connecting science, and we're feeding this growing field. So, what if we do this? What if we succeed? I have a story that gives me so much hope for what the world might look like if we are able to effectively train this next cadre, if we are able to build a difference industry. You know the story so well of the Montgomery bus boycott. You learned it at school, and you know about the heroism of Rosa Parks, and you know about Martin Luther King Jr., and you know about the sacrifice and organization that went into creating this campaign. But I think there's somebody in this story who you have not yet met, and I would like to introduce you to her today. Her name is Joanne Robinson, and she is exactly the kind of strategist who I aspire to teach my students to be. Joanne Robinson was a professor at the Alabama State College. And in her role there, one day in 1949, she boarded a bus to go and visit her family for Christmas. And she sat toward the front of the bus, which was empty, but the bus driver saw that, and he came toward her, and he raised his hand toward her and told her to get out of the seat. She got off the bus in tears, and she never forgot the humiliation of that moment. So in 1950, when she became the president of the Women's Political Council, she identified that a bus boycott might be the best way to start to end segregation in Montgomery. Because you could have redundant schools, you could have these redundant restaurants, but transportation infrastructure was so costly that she suspected that if they could undo that, everything else will fall. And so she began to develop a strategy to develop a boycott. And in 1954, she wrote to the mayor of Montgomery saying, we could do this. We could do this boycott. We could create this boycott. And if we did that, this would be very bad for the bus company because we comprise most of the riders. Her letter goes unanswered. And so she waits and she bides her time. And then one day, a young woman named Claudette Colvin is arrested for refusing to give up her seat. It's March 1955. But Claudette Colvin swears, she's violent, and Joanne Robinson is concerned that she lacks the charisma to get everybody to rally behind her for a boycott. Another young woman, another 18-year-old woman, is arrested somewhat after that, and Joanne Robinson continues and she waits to she bides her time. And then on December 1st, Rosa Parks refuses to give up her seat. And she does so with such grace, hiding the rage that was surely within her, that Joanne Robinson knows that this is the moment. And so that night, she goes back to her office. She sits down at the typewriter. She types out a flyer. And then she meets a friend in the mimeograph room at the university, and she and her students together make thousands and thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of copies of the flyer, and they cut them and they bundle them. And then at 4 o'clock in the morning, they sit and they pull out the notes that Joanne Robinson had about how they would disperse them throughout the entire city of Montgomery so that by that night, every Black person in Montgomery would have a copy of that flyer. Can you imagine how it must have felt to have somebody place that flyer in your hand and to read that and to know that maybe that moment of no more had come? I think about this story so much because it inspires me to think about how else we can drive these kinds of changes. What if Joanne Robinson had been waiting in the wings in Ferguson? My favorite thing about this story is that Joanne Robinson was so pitch perfect with her strategy and her distribution and her message and her call to action and her timing that she actually forced the hand of the civil rights leaders in Montgomery. They didn't want a boycott. They were concerned that people were going to get hurt. They were concerned that there wouldn't be enough support. But that following Monday, everybody participated in the boycott. And that night, they met in the Baptist church in Montgomery and voted to continue the bus boycott. The boycott went on for 381 days, and you know the rest of that story. They elected Martin Luther King Jr. as their leader. Strategic communications is the fire on the flame of change. Imagine a flame, and imagine pouring gasoline on that flame. It turns into a fire, and you can't separate the gasoline from the flame. So, imagine this industry of difference makers, a group of people with the specific skill set associated with driving these kinds of things. Wouldn't it be amazing to approach a little kid, as we often do, and to look at her and to say, so what do you want to be? What do you want to be when you grow up? And instead of saying, oh, I want to be a doctor, or I want to be an engineer, and I want to build bridges, what if instead she looked at you and she said, I want to be a public interest communicator? And instead of bridges, I will build movements. Thank you.